to be here. And in honor of doing something that I've long wanted to do, I'm going to try an experiment. I've done away with PowerPoint today. I usually rely on PowerPoint. Closer? Yes? Okay. I usually rely on PowerPoint when I give talks, but I thought this is India, and I'm just going to move as the spirit moves me and talk. And so we'll see. It's an experiment. My last book was about Plato and the ancient Greeks. I'm not a Plato scholar. I know many Plato scholars. My area of specialty in philosophy is more contemporary philosophy, philosophy of science, philosophy of mind. But I've long, like so many philosophers, been intrigued by Plato. He's still a very important philosopher, even though he lived 2,500 years ago. And even more, I've been intrigued by the ancient Greeks and how they invented this discipline of philosophy and invented so much else in addition, including the very beginnings of science and of formal mathematics. Euclid was who you probably all studied in high school. Euclid was born 37 years after Plato died. The Greeks invented great art, amazing tragic poetry, that is tragic drama, architecture, and also democracy. So this is quite a number of gifts that they've given us, and it's often said that the ancient Greeks founded Western civilization. So it's great gifts and it's great mystery because they did it in record time. They went in basically 200 years from illiteracy. They had lost their first alphabet, and so they had been in a totally oral society. No, they saw inscriptions on the architecture that had been left behind from the great cultures, the Mycenaean cultures, but that had all been destroyed, and they had fallen into illiteracy and into chaos, anarchy. Scholars call it the Dark Ages in Greek history. And they went in relatively short time, 200 years, from this state of illiteracy to Aristotle and to Aeschylus, the great Greek dramatist. So there's this great mystery. How did they do it, this achievement? And of course, I was most interested in why they invented philosophy. And so I thought that for this book, I wanted to tackle these big mysteries, but I had this other idea. You know, it's hard to get people to read philosophy. I don't know why. I think it's the most enjoyable and marvelous thing to read. But people find it difficult to read scholarly philosophy. And so I've been experimenting all of my professional life with forms of making philosophy, not diluting it, giving people the real stuff, the real ideas, the hard stuff, but in forms that would make it connected to their lives. Because I think that philosophy that's divorced from one's life, and even in my fields of specialty, philosophy of mathematics, in some sense, I do think it's a part of life, it's a part of our trying to figure out what it is to be human, what the limits of knowability are there things that we can't know, and just how to get our bearings in this great chaotic world, and this world that we find ourselves in. And what is our purpose, if anything, what is our meaning, how to live a life that's worth living. This is a question that we all face and that is center, core to our being, however we approach it. And philosophy deals with these questions. No matter what discipline of philosophy, it deals with these questions. But it deals with them through reason, through argumentation, through self-critical reason. So everything you put on the table is subject to criticism. It's very argumentative. Any of you who have taken philosophy know that the more you pursue it, the more argumentative it becomes. I'm very upset if I give a talk in front of professional philosophers and they don't immediately start to attack me afterwards. That means they're not taking me seriously, right? If they take me seriously, they're going to start thinking of counterexamples and ways to challenge what I'm saying. So it's that kind of very argumentative, self-critical, everything open to debate, trying to pull forth one's intuitions into the light of day and subject them to other people and to criticisms. And so this was all started in ancient Greece, and that really interested me. So I wanted to go after that question. I came up with a theory, and maybe I'll share it with you today, what my theory was, why the Greeks approached philosophy in this purely reasoned way, leaving their religion out of it. They were a deeply religious society. They had religious rites for everything, for their sports, for their everything that took place in the house. If they'd go on a voyage, everything. There were religious rituals, appeals to the gods, but they developed secular philosophy, a way of going after these big questions, leaving their gods out of it, and using our capacity for reason. And that's very interesting that occurred in ancient Greece. And it was at a time when the great religious paradigms were being forged. Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, the Hebraic, the Abrahamic religion, Confucianism, Taoism, Jainism. These were all, it was the same period, roughly 800 to 200 BCE, that these normative systems, these great systems that persist till today, all of us identify with one or another of these systems, including the secular approach of philosophy, but it could be a religious approach. All of us today can trace our normative paradigms back to this incredibly fertile, normatively fertile, creative period, roughly 800 to 200 BCE. So what happened in ancient Greece didn't happen in isolation. In fact, the great highlight of the period, historians call it the axial age, when all of these normative paradigms burst forth. The great height of this period was probably the 6th century BCE. And Pythagoras, the mystic mathematician, Aeschylus, the great dramatist, the Buddha, Confucius, and some of the Hebrew prophets, including Ezekiel, they were all contemporaries of each other. So something amazing was going on, not just in ancient Greece, but in many centers of the globe, including here in India. And so what was going on here that produced this normative creativity? I'm using normative, the word normative as philosophers use it, which means basically moral, propositions having to do what ought to be the case, rather than simply what is the case. That's how philosophers use the word normative. Anyway, so that was something I wanted to consider in this book. And the other thing I wanted to do, since I come from mostly a scientific background in my orientation, is very scientific. I tend to hang around mostly with scientists who often don't get the point of philosophy and think of it as a great waste of time. And one of the ways that they will often put down a question or a statement or a speculation is to say it's a merely philosophical, meaning it's just sort of airy, it's based on nothing, it's based on no evidence. One opinion is as good as the next. And so I thought that I would, in trying to understand the foundations of philosophy, why this discipline was forged during this time of great normative creativity, great normative ferment, why it persists till today, that philosophy still has a place even in the age of Google. And I thought, well, how can I do this in a creative way that will make it enjoyable to read? And it occurred to me, well, I can use Plato himself and the dialogue form, which was the form in which he wrote, right? All of his philosophy was written as dialogues. Some historians believe that these dialogues were actually plays, philosophical plays that were meant to be performed in the Academy, which was the first European university founded by Plato, Athens. And so Plato himself makes use of a kind of fictional form, theatrical form, the dialogue, to present his philosophical ideas. Clearly he's not watering down the ideas by presenting them in this creative, semi-fictional way. And I thought, well, I can do that. I've been writing fiction. I've trained for this sort of thing. And I'll bring Plato into our day. This is a sort of metaphorical way of saying that Plato lives on in our day, at least the questions that he asks lives on in our day. And I'll do to Plato what he did to Socrates, his teacher, who never wrote anything. We only know about Socrates by way of Plato's dialogues. I'll turn Plato into a character in my dialogues, and there'll be 5 of them interspersed in between these chapters in which I tried to solve this problem of why the Greeks created philosophy, why this was their approach to the great normative questions that come to the boil during this period of human history in certain cosmopolitan centers. And then my next thought was, when I thought, okay, I'll turn Plato into a character in a dialogue, was, how dare I? Who am I to do this? How can I possibly do this? First of all, we don't really know very much about Plato. He's quite mysterious. He doesn't write about himself. We have some letters that may or may not be authentic, but he uses he doesn't appear in his own dialogues. He speaks through the character of Socrates. So how could I possibly have the audacity to tackle Plato as a character and the way he thinks? And then I just decided to do it. And the kind of personality that I gave to Plato was what I think of as the best of the discipline in which I was trained, philosophy. So I gave him sort of what I take to be the best of there are some of the characteristics that are brought out in this very argumentative and pugilistic field are not very pleasant. It can often, ego can get in the way, as ego gets in the way of everything, when people just want to make their points and win over the other guy. There's that kind of thing. But I think philosophy at its most expansive and agreeable and inspiring. It's not an ego game, clearly, but it is a love of truth beyond anything. So a willingness to bare your soul and to put your deepest intuitions to the test. Have people go after them, criticize them, can be painful, but a love of truth beyond anything. A great hunger for knowledge. It's not enough to just know philosophical texts, but one should try to know everything, because so many philosophical questions play off of other things that are known, for example, in science, that give rise to philosophical questions. So it's extremely important to try to just absorb as much knowledge as possible. And that seemed to me the founder of the Academy would be very, very aware of, and we know really from what he accomplished in his dialogues that this was true of Plato. I also wanted him to be playful, because I think philosophy at its best has a kind of playful attitude. There's humor in Plato, actually. Plato's quite funny in his dialogues. Sometimes at the expense of our species, of humans. He had a kind of cynical view of us, but he was also very hopeful of what we could accomplish. But a playfulness of ideas, and Plato himself thought that play was very, very important. When he was trying to pick out who should be the future leaders among children, the quality of their play was very, very important. Also their love of truth. He said that this appears very young in certain children, their love of truth. You can try to convince them of stories, and they'll just keep asking questions and seeing through the stories, that they're stories, and that this would be a good sign that they will make the most out of their philosophical training. So I wanted him to be like that. I wanted him also to have a sense of the tragic dimension of life, because I think that this was key not just to Western philosophy, but in fact to all of those normative paradigms that arose contemporaneously with Western philosophy. A sense that we're mortal, that we're finite, that we're facing death, that so many people have come before us, and there's no trace of them. It's lost. It's as if they never have existed at all. Nobody remembers their names. Why should we expect anything different to be true of us? There's that sort of tragic dimension that was very appreciated in the society in which Plato grew up, in ancient Greek society. You just have to read Greek tragic drama to know what a preoccupation, what an obsession this was with the ancient Greeks, how to make the most of this short time that we have here, but a sense of our mortality. So there's that dimension, there's that dark element, which I think is true of philosophy. So that was basic. Oh, and one other aspect of Plato as a character that I really wanted to get in was his love. Not just, philosophy means love of knowledge, but that's a very kind of impersonal love. And yes, one wants to have this love of knowledge, love of wisdom. But Plato actually loved a person. He loved Socrates. That's very apparent. That comes through in the dialogues. The fact that Socrates was put to death by the reconstituted democracy of ancient Athens was the great tragedy of Plato's life. He was a young man. He left Athens and traveled around. He went to Egypt. Some people think he may even have come to India, although that was quite far away. But ancient Greece, they were trading with India. He went to Sicily, where the Pythagoreans had settled. He was very influenced by them. That's how the great priority of mathematics enters into Plato's system. So the death of Socrates is a deeply traumatic experience for Plato. He finally comes back to Athens, he founds the academy, and he writes these dialogues, and these dialogues were meant for the population at large. It's not what he was teaching in the academy. These were very readable dialogues, and he makes Socrates the major figure. There are 27 of his dialogues, 26 dialogues. I wish they were 27. There are 26 dialogues, and Socrates appears in 25 of them. It's only the very last dialogue, the Laws, in which Socrates is absent. So it's as if he wants to bring Socrates along with him in his long philosophical voyage. He changed his mind, he grew beyond Socrates, he asked questions that Socrates had never asked. He laid out the entire philosophical landscape in some way, all the different domains of philosophy. He didn't give us all the answers. That would be ridiculous to think that he did. Otherwise, what's the good of having philosophers like me around, people who are still asking the questions and trying to come up with answers? It's not that he gave us all the answers, but he did give us all of the fundamental questions in philosophy. He laid them all out. And that's an extraordinary thing. And it's as if he wanted to bring Socrates along with him, that he makes him this figure in his, and often the mouthpiece of ideas that Socrates never had. This is a great act of veneration, and I think of love. And so that's the one personal thing we really know about Plato, that he loved that man, Socrates. And so that was very, very important. That's all I really had to go on in creating this character of Plato, as a way really to just show how these questions, which I show in the more explanatory chapters, why they arose in ancient Greece, how the ancient Greeks went after it, these questions, how they still occur now. And so I just give you briefly what these 5 dialogues that I brought Plato into our society, what they had to do with. And the first was, I did take him to the Googleplex. The Googleplex is the headquarters, the world headquarters of Google, and it's in Mountain View, California. They actually invite authors to speak there, authors at Google, and so I had been there once, and then I came back after I wrote the book, but very, very smart people there at the Googleplex, and I remember getting, the first time I went there, some of my toughest questions, tougher even than in front of philosophical audiences, and I thought it would be interesting to bring Plato there, to the heart of our technology. Plato was very suspicious of technology. In his day, the newfangled technology was writing things down. I had said this, the ancient Greeks had been an oral society, and it was about 800 BCE that they imported an alphabet from Phoenicia and into their society. It was really only the aristocrats, the upper classes, who knew how to read. But Plato, in fact, in one of his dialogues, the Phaedrus, great suspicion about writing things down. He thought it was going to ruin people's minds. They were going to forget how to think. They would think that they know something simply because it was out there in the book, and that they could go and refer to the book instead of incorporating it into their minds, instead of making it part of their minds in the way that one does when one memorizes things. So I thought it would be interesting to take him to to Google, right? To the heart of our technological age. And he gets into dialogue there with a software engineer who thinks that he has created a search engine that could answer all ethical questions. And he calls this search engine, it would be able to crowdsource and it would be able to answer all of our ethical questions through the kind of search engine that Google itself developed, through some sort of algorithm of crowdsourcing. And he called it the Ethical Answer Search Engine, EASE. And so all of these questions that philosophers scratch their heads over, having to do with ethics, could be answered with EASE, with ease, right? And so, and actually, for a while, I think for about 2 days, I convinced myself that this software engineer had a really good point. And one of the things one learns about when one's trained in philosophy is that before you can pick an argument to pieces, you have to make it the strongest argument you possibly can, because what's the good of just fighting duels with straw men, with just weak arguments? So if you really want to know whether this argument doesn't establish its conclusion, it's not a sound argument, you have to really beef it up and make it the strongest argument you can. And so I worked so hard to make this software engineer's argument strong, that all of these questions could be answered through a search engine. Then, for about 2 days, I thought, why not? Why couldn't it be? And then, but then I went to work, or I had Plato go to work, taking this argument apart. So that was the first dialogue. It was also a dialogue in which I tried to impress on Plato. This was very important to me. My character of Plato in the 21st century, who, by the way, he's on a book tour. He's going around and selling his books. But I wanted to convince Plato that we philosophers, or we humanity, common humanity, had come a long way in our philosophical and in particular our ethical knowledge than he had dreamt of. And so, for example, he's shocked to discover that there are no slaves in contemporary California, right? That this is, and sure enough, the slavery was it was characterized all of these centers of civilization in Plato's time, and these very great ethical ancient Greek thinkers like Plato, like Aristotle, never formulated an argument that slavery was wrong. It didn't occur to them that slavery could possibly be wrong. And he's gobsmacked that there are no slaves, and then to try to show him that this is not just a philosophical opinion that we've come to, that this has penetrated society at large. I have his media escort. When you're on book tour, you're assigned a person, and it's often a she, it's usually a she. She takes you around from event to event, takes care of you, makes conversation with you. It's the media escort who's not a terribly educated woman, and it's kind of funny. She was a comic relief sort of character. She's the one who convinces Plato that slavery is wrong, using the kinds of arguments that were developed by philosophers generations, centuries ago, really, but that have disseminated to all of us now. So it's off the table. We don't have to argue about this anymore. So that was the first dialogue. The second place I brought him to was to New York, to the 92nd Street Y, which is a great center of intellectual life in New York. And there he talks about raising children. This was something he was extremely interested in. He was extremely interested in reforming society, to make society safe so that a person like Socrates would not be put on trial and voted guilty by his fellow democratic citizens, how to make our society safe for free thinking, for philosophy, where everything can be put on the table and questioned, and our deepest, dearest core intuitions can be subjected to criticism. How to remake the society, and he thinks well, if we want to remake society, we have to think about educating our children. And so education was something that he thought about a great deal. And so I have him on a panel there, and he's discussing how to raise the perfect child with somebody who is sort of the tiger mother. I call her the warrior mother, Amy Chua, who subsequently became a dear friend of mine. She forgave me for turning her into a character in my dialogue, and also a kind of a psychoanalyst. Anyway, they talk about raising children as a philosophical issue, as an ethical issue. And I also have him giving love and romance advice. And I actually have a dear friend who used to be a agony aunt, right? People would write in with their personal problems, and she would give them advice. Often it was about, love and romance. Interestingly, Plato thought love and romance was a philosophical issue. He dedicated not just one dialogue, the Symposium, a very famous dialogue, but two, the Phaedrus, to this topic of romantic love, and whether it's good for us, whether it's a kind of, he said it was a kind of madness, but whether it was a good kind of madness that led to wisdom, creativity, and morality, or whether it was the bad kind of madness that's delusion and is going to end with sadness and tragedy and irrationality, right? The thing he was most afraid of. And so I have him, I wrote letters, and I first gave it to my friend, and she gave her advice to these made-up questions that were very much based on things that he addresses in the Symposium and in the Phaedrus. And then I had Plato answering. I should say that as often as I could, I used Plato's words, and I could use them very, very often. It meant I had to memorize the 26 dialogues so that I would be able to take out passages and slip them in as often as I can. And my hope was that without the footnotes, which I did provide, so you could go back to the dialogues and see where they came from, that without that, you wouldn't know, because it slips into our contemporary discussions. And so I wasn't just making up Plato's words. I was always taking them out and putting them in, and then weaving more contemporary things around them. And the last place I take Plato is to, I started with science and technology, and I ended with science and technology. I had him take a brain scan. This is one of the most amazing things that I actually volunteered as a subject in a neuroscientist lab. So I got to see my brain at work. First they asked me questions in math, and then other questions, and so I got, and then I got the pictures of my brain at work, and so it was an amazing experience to actually see the brain, your very own brain. But I have Plato doing that, and I had to do it so I could describe what it's like to do it. And I had him, I was just wondering if somebody was coming to tell me time is up. Will you give me a sign? Yes, good. So I had him get into a conversation with these neuroscientists about moral agency, moral responsibility, whether we can, free will, whether we can still hold on to these ideas given now all that we know about the brain through neuroscience. And then, then I had to say farewell to my character of Plato. So this was a way of trying to bring Plato into our society, trying to show that the questions that he asked are still very much with us, no matter how much scientific and technological advances we've made. And so a way of showing that, yes, philosophy is always going to be with us. So it's time to stop, and
Okay.
for a philosopher, always the best part are questions.
Well, I'm pretty sure we're also intrigued by the concept of Plato in the time of Google. I can see a lot of faces with a lot of questions. So go ahead, raise your questions. Yes, sir, please.
Well, thank you very much. Two things. Firstly, is there a field of quantum philosophy which might explain why these ideas emerge simultaneously across the globe? Because you refer to Greek school emerging at the same time as Buddhism, Jainism, Zoroastrianism, and all that. Leave it with you as a thought, given your background in science as well. Yeah. Secondly, I'm intrigued by your choice of the philosopher in these times, Plato. I would have thought some of the later Greeks, Epictetus and Aurelius, would have been more relevant for our times than the more academic, if I may put it that way. I don't mean it in a pejorative way.
Yes.
Philosopher that you have chosen.
Yes. Could you repeat the first question?
So could you please reiterate your first question?
Facetious question. Is there a field of quantum philosophy?
Is there quantum philosophy?
Which might explain why these ideas emerge across the globe unconnected, like quantum physics.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's okay if I stand.
Sure,
I think better when yes. So actually, one of my major philosophical preoccupations is found in quantum physics, right, and the very, very strange world that quantum physics places us in, including what I think you're alluding to, non-locality, what Einstein had called spooky action at a distance, that when particles have been entangled together, when quantum entanglement, then no matter how far apart they are from each other, whatever happens to one instantaneously is transmitted to the other. This is a great difficulty in quantum mechanics to try to understand this, and especially because it seems to violate relativity theory, that nothing can go faster than the speed of light. So it's a huge, in philosophy of science, this is a huge problem to try to understand. And so I think that's what you're alluding to, that what was going on in these various centers of civilization in China, in India, up in the Judean hills, in Europe, in the form of the Greeks, in Persia, Zoroastrianism, what was happening that these great normative systems were being thought about, and ideas, very different ideas, were being proposed that have enough staying power to last into our own day. None of us are followers of the ancient Greek religion. Nobody I've met believes in Zeus or Aphrodite or Ares. But Greece lives on in Greek philosophy. But the other civilizations that were discussing these questions, they proposed more religious ideas. But what was happening there? So I don't think it was quantum non-locality. I guess I don't think that you were proposing that seriously. What I do think is, if you actually look at all of the centers that participated in what we call the axial age, they were the best fed areas on the globe. The caloric intake of all of those areas was the highest. And so this, I think, tells us something very, very interesting about us, this human species, true of all of us, which is that when we don't have to worry about survival 24/7, when we're not just trying to fill our bellies and fill the bellies of our children, and make sure and hope to see another dawn, then we think about what is survival for? What are we here for? So it's not an accident that all of the places that forged these great normative systems were the best fed places on the globe at that time. They also had they had written alphabets. So things they could learn from the past. They could pass on their knowledge. They had scholarly class. They were usually living in cosmopolitan areas where there was a chance to talk with other people and see other people. They were trading with different parts so they could see other ways of living. They could give them a broader perspective, and they could ask the great fundamental existential question, which is, what are we supposed to do with our lives? If we're lucky enough to have the luxury of being able to ask this question, if survival is a certain enough thing, then this becomes very natural, and that we all ask this, and these paradigms that were forged relate enough to all of us, resonate enough with all of us that one way or the other, we find ourselves to them, whether it's in terms of a religion or in terms of the secular approach that the Greeks formulated. And why Plato? That was your second question. Because he did it. He really laid out what philosophy was, what this approach was. That he asked, philosophy is divided into many different sub-specialties. For just about every area of human interest and human inquiry, there is a related philosophy of that area, that interest. So there's, philosophy of science, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of religion, philosophy of education, philosophy of history, philosophy of language, philosophy of ethics itself, philosophy of knowledge itself, epistemology, philosophy of politics, philosophy, for every philosophy of art. So for every area of human inquiry, there is the kind of philosophical question that you can ask about it that's related to the questions that the practitioners ask, but is different. It's related to them, but it's philosophical. Plato, the reason he's quite amazing to philosophers, Alfred North Whitehead, who was a British philosopher, very good philosopher, also a great logician, worked with Bertrand Russell on Principia Mathematica. He had said that the one true thing that you could say about Western philosophy was that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Now, I always hated that because it's like, oh, why should I be in this field? I should be in science that makes progress. Why should I be in a field that's a series of footnotes to somebody who lived 2,500 years ago? That sounds like it hasn't made very much progress at all. But so I think Whitehead's statement rather should be that Plato laid out this sort of territory of philosophy. He had a very good nose for the typical philosophical question that doesn't depend on empirical evidence, but yet that we can make headway with. It's not scientific, but we can make headway with it through using pure formal reason, the argumentative form. So that's why Plato has this sort of special role in the history of Western philosophy. It was extremely important to me to not look at things just through the eyes of Western philosophy, but to try to relate the amazing thing that was happening in ancient Greece to the amazing things that were happening in many parts of the globe: China, India, Persia, Egypt, the Judean hills. And so that was also something that I was very aware of. So I hope that...
Sir, I'm sure that answers your question.
Ma'am, may I just ask one thing about...
Right.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Ma'am, could you speak about Aristotle a little bit? He's considered the teacher of teacher of Plato, and he's also considered as good as
Just 1 second, sir. Yep.
Plato. Could you speak something on Aristotle, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see where you were
Yeah.
coming from.
Yeah.
Yes. Could you repeat it?
Yeah. Aristotle is considered the student of Plato.
Aristotle.
Yeah. And he is considered among like great philosophers. He is considered as equal to as Plato.
As Plato, yes.
So he also developed theories on science. So could you please speak on him?
Aristotle.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, and of course, Aristotle attended the academy that Plato had founded, and he had come from the north, and he came to Athens as many thinkers, artists, writers came to Athens. You all know that ancient Greece was divided into separate city-states, independent. They differed among themselves in terms of their form of government. Only really ancient Athens had the democracy. There were oligarchies and monarchies. So there was a great smorgasbord, a great buffet of different ways of organizing society that were represented just there in ancient Greece. Aristotle came to the academy. He left, and when he was not chosen after Plato's death to run the academy, he founded his own academy in the Lyceum, his own place of higher learning. And one of the things one of the cliches in Western philosophy is that all philosophical thinkers are either Platonists or Aristotelians, that those are the polarities, and that Plato is more into mathematics and abstract reasoning and doesn't have much use for observation. For him, the highest explanation comes from mathematics, and that's the key to understanding. And actually, in his academy, he gathered together all of the mathematicians of ancient Greece. I mean, that's where he was putting his focus. And with Aristotle, he's much more observationally oriented, much more empirically oriented. Plato's hobby was mathematics, and Aristotle's hobby was biology, and he was a great observer. Empiricism is very, very important to Aristotle. And in Western philosophy, we divide up thinkers into the rationalists on one side, who think that you can make much headway through pure a priori, deductive thinking, just pure logic, and that observation is sort of after the fact, and the empiricists, who say everything has to be grounded in observation, that their pure a priori reason can't give us anything of substance, and that this duality that perpetuates itself into our own day in philosophy and in science as well. String theorists, for example, great rationalists, they're not very, very interested in observation. The math is supposed to accomplish everything, as opposed to other scientists, that this duality between the rationalists and the empiricists that we still see among thinkers today had its origin back there in ancient Greece, in this duality between Plato and Aristotle. So it's a very important question that you asked, and yet another way of seeing that what happened back there in ancient Greece continues to reverberate, into our own day, into even interpretations of quantum mechanics and other things going on in science. How important is just pure mathematics, and how important is observation? So,
since we're running a little short on time, we're going to take the last two questions. Yes, sir, please.
Plato gave the concept of philosopher king.
So could you be a little loud, please?
Plato gave the concept of king. Is that concept relevant in our times? Have you come across any ruler, any political leaders which,
Oh.
which come close to Philosopher King?
Wait. Political and Plato. So, did you mention the word Philosopher King? Yes, yes. So, Plato's, a driving force in Plato, and it was really the real reason he created the academy, was to try to train political leaders. He wanted to train the future leaders of Athens. He did not have great faith in Athenian democracy. After all, they had put Socrates to death. It was the democracy that put Socrates to death. And so, this question, as I said before, Plato asked all the right questions, all the good questions. He proposed answers. He changed his mind many times in the course of his philosophical life. But he asked all the good questions. And this question, right, what is the kind of person who ought to lead our society, who sees to the common good? That's what he was after, right? And his notion of the Philosopher King was, first, you try to pick out among the children, the ones who don't believe lies, the ones who have a certain spark in their creativity and a tenacity. You pick out those children who have the right spirit, and then you train them, and you train them, and you train them. You train them so that they will be disinterested, that they will be interested only in the common good, that they will have no ego, no personal ambition, no hunger for power or for material goods. Only that kind of person can be the good leader. And then, just to make sure, you don't allow them to own any personal property. The guardian class and the Republican cannot own any personal property. So that's how difficult a problem he saw it to be, how we could train uncorruptible leaders. Have we solved this problem? I come to you from Trump's America. I tell you, we have not solved this problem. And every day when I read the newspapers, I hear, which I memorize, the words of Plato, the dangers of democracy, our susceptibility to the demagogue, our susceptibility to the person who is only in it for their own power. Have we solved this problem? No. But he knew it was a damn good problem. And that's why he's amazing. That's why he's such an amazing thinker. But yes.
Okay, we'll take one last question. Yes, sir, please.
We are living in the times of Modi, so we resonate your thoughts on that.
We're living in the times of Narendra Modi.
That's right.
We're living in the times of a current Prime Minister.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes. I sympathize.
resonate
Yes, I
with your
understand. Yes.
So, what could you term as the accomplishments of contemporary philosophy? Like, I'll qualify that question. One indicator of progress in philosophy is that it leaves us with a fresh perspective, powerful perspective,
Yeah.
like Kant, enlightenment.
Yeah.
Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. So what would those be in today's contemporary philosophy, the accomplishments? And the second question is, what is the import of Plato's works on the foundations of linguistics, which Chomsky has laid out?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I hope I
Okay,
understood
stop.
everything.
Repeat your first question again.
Yeah.
So the accomplishments of contemporary
It's
philosophy, I'm
an
asking about.
accomplishment, yes. So, well, the accomplishments in philosophy often come from asking really good questions, right? Proposing new questions. But I'll tell you, I mean, again, I tend to think of things in philosophy of science, even though I'm talking about Plato. But we have this weird theory that is quantum mechanics, very weird theory. When I was in university and taking physics courses, there was we don't quite know how to interpret this strange theory. And scientists had decided that the best way to deal with these questions was to say that they were meaningless questions. Like the kind of question, what kind of reality is this that's being described by these equations, right? And I had such a physics professor, and I was only interested in physics because I wanted to know what reality was like, right? That was the whole wonder of physics, and I had been completely wowed and seduced by relativity theory, which is a realistic theory. It describes, space, time, and it's finite, but it's curved, and that's the way it is, and how amazing this is. But you weren't allowed to ask that question of quantum mechanics, and this was known as the Copenhagen Interpretation, proposed by Niels Bohr. He had a famous controversy with Einstein, and everybody said that Niels Bohr won the debate with Einstein, which is you don't ask this question. It's a meaningless question to say, what is reality really like? And that's how one was trained as a physics student, which is one of the things that drove me into philosophy. But philosophers who stayed with it kept asking the question and saying to the physicists, this is not acceptable, right? It's you're going to have to come up with something better. Yeah. And some philosophers proposed various ideas. For example, the multiverse. It actually first was proposed by philosophers. In fact, the notion, the term multiverse came from William James, a philosopher who lived in the early 20th century. So it was this kind of goading of physicists to come up with interpretations that could bring us reality back. I mean, what's the good of physics if it's not going to describe reality? And come up with some more imaginative ways of trying to accommodate the strangeness of quantum mechanics to a realistic interpretation. So it's sort of, I chalk that up as a great achievement of philosophers. I mean, now the scientists who have proposed this will get, of course, all the acclaim. They did it. They showed that you get the right results, the right empirical results, and good for them. But the philosophers sort of goaded them into this. Many things have also been claimed by neuroscientists about what their various findings imply concerning moral responsibility, free will, our own agency. And philosophers, they study these things and they say, no, you're concluding too hastily. I mean, I think that's one of the roles of philosophers. It's very, very, so, okay, that's a kind of answer. It's not a magnificent kind of achievements, but it's important. It is important. Should we end there?
The last question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, what was the import of Plato's works on linguistics, which Chomsky laid the foundations for?
Oh, and linguistics. Okay, the short answer is, so Plato had this idea that ideas exist, right? The forms, they exist, and words get their meaning by referring to these abstract meanings, and that it's not all in your head. Meaning is not all in your head. This kind of idea, although the theory of forms does not live on, but the idea that meanings are not necessarily all in your head, this still has legs in philosophy. In fact, a philosopher named Hilary Putnam, who died a few years ago, a philosopher at Harvard, very important philosopher. What was the name of his famous article? Something like, what was it? The meaning of meaning. Okay, so it was the meaning of meaning, but he had a line in it, as I was thinking, which is it's not in your head. It ain't necessarily in your head. And he has this very technical thought experiment to try to prove this. It's a kind of Platonic answer. In philosophy of mathematics, Plato really lives on, that we call mathematical Platonism is the view that we don't create mathematics, we don't invent mathematics, we discover mathematics. It's out there to be discovered. It has an independent, objective existence. So this kind of orientation, that the ideal actually exists, not everything is made up, this is the way, this is a kind of Platonic orientation that still lives on. Not too much, it's not that much, but it's something. But it was 2,500 years ago.